I don't hear the music. Bring it up.
What's happening out there, Colored Commentary family? We are here again in Colored Commentary Live, happening right here. Colorful conversations by colorful people about Christianity, culture, and race. I am one of your hosts, Marcus Lloyd, in here as always, and as always with me in here is Antoine Malone. What's happening, Antoine?
Yo, what's up? What's up, everyone? How are you doing this holiday? This holiday season.
Holiday season. That's right.
One
We are
more,
in the Christmas season, man.
one more week to go before we are.
Is it immediate? Is it a like? Is it an actual one more week? Is it like a week?
It's the
It's one more.
17th, so 8 days.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so and me and my wife are still working through Christmas,
Like working
shopping
through
and
like
gifts.
oh,
Yeah,
trying to get the gifts together.
we are not done yet. Yeah, in fact,
Well, of course not.
so
That would
it
not
is.
be a Christmas tradition. The Christmas tradition
It's got to
is
be a
to
little frantic, a little bit at
yeah,
some
yeah. You
point.
got to do it. And it
Otherwise
gets
you're not doing it right.
and I wonder. I think it gets a little bit more frantic because there's the Amazon like the ordering online piece. So it's not like you
That's
can
the
just
thing.
like roll to to Macy's, as you used to as a kid, or Bell's, or Palais Royale, right?
Well,
Go
yeah,
get your
because
stuff.
this year I was telling like this year's totally different because we're doing it. So much of what we're doing is online, and my Christmas shopping methodology has generally sometimes been to walk into a store not knowing what I'm going to do, and
Exactly.
just kind of walking around and
Right.
seeing what's available. That's not
Mhm.
as easy on Amazon. I mean, it's
No,
easy-ish, but you got to kind of have an idea
you have
what
to
you
have an
want.
idea. They give you
Christmas.
some categories. You can be like Christmas gifts, and then it
Right,
just kind
but
of
like
gives you stuff.
yeah, I guess so. But like the best Christmas gifts are those ones that are unexpected.
To you, yeah, absolutely. Like that's the piece is, you jump in and you're walking around and you see, something that you weren't expecting to see, and you jump into that, right? So that's exactly what's going on. So
Okay, I'm here.
I'm
Sorry,
excited. I'm excited to
sorry
do
about
that.
that. Am I back now?
You're back. Here's the thing. I was covering so well for you, like nobody knew you left. So I was just hoping you would just jump in and listen for a second and then know
No,
we
I
were
just
done.
tried to get right back in. Interrupt your stuff. I don't know what happened. I think my elbow hit my mouse, which is a back button. Whatever. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It's
Back in.
okay. Again, we do this all the time. I know what you were trying to say. I finished your sentence.
You did. You
It
you
were
you said the best gifts are the ones that you stumble upon.
they stumble upon. And you're like,
The,
oh,
the
that's a
ones
great
that
gift for somebody.
the ones that you find for someone. You're like, oh, she would love this.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
had no idea that she
Nope.
would love that. Anyway, you get
That's
it.
it. That's
All
it.
right.
Well, you're talking about like you talk about stress, Christmas stress, things of that nature. There's today I think we're kind of talking about a kind of stress, right? Like we've been in this work for a while now, this work of engaging in racial reconciliation, racial unity, racial justice. And you and I talk about it all the time. Like it's this moving target, and you've always got to be on, you've always got to be ready, you've always got to be reading. And it can be really exhausting, and particularly if you're trying to like do the work and people aren't responding not only to you and what you're saying, but even in logical ways, right? And so that can get a bit kind of tedious. And I don't know about you, but as I'm ending the season, like I want to get like I want to feel the hope, and I want to also get the not only the hope of like there's good things coming, but also kind of like that hope that I can persevere through it, right? And so I think there's other folks as we talk about in Threaded, we want to come alongside you folks who are out there trying to weave the community back together. We want to come alongside you and help you, give you tools and things that we're learning and that we're engaging in to help you do the things that you're trying to do in the community. We want to be that guide. And so today we're going to talk about a few things and engage in some of that stuff, how to deal with some of this justice fatigue. And so when we were talking about it and planning the show a couple months ago, I was like, I know who we need to get back in here. We need to get a good friend of ours that's been on the show before. And we love having her on the show. I love talking to her just regularly. You'll remember her when we get in here, hopefully, about even the relationship that she and I have had. She is a professor of urban studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. She is a chaplain for Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. She does coaching with cities together. She does these city walks in LA. But one of the things that I think is really helpful for even what we're talking about today is she teaches in the Masters of Justice and Advocacy program at the Fuller Theological Seminary. Lots of classes really talking about your vocation in God's shalom. Really talking to practitioners in the justice work about how they can survive and maintain the work that they're doing. So I would love for you to welcome to this Color Commentary Live show, Dr. Mary Glenn. What's happening, Mary? There she
Hey,
is.
good to
Hey,
see
hey,
you
hey.
both.
How you doing? Good to have you in the show.
It's Mary in the house.
That's right, Mary in the house, and it's it's Christmas, so we thought we need a guest named Mary, so we can kind of keep all of this stuff in close. How many of those jokes do you get like
Yes.
this time
So,
of year?
so funny story. I worked at a camp for many years, and we had to make a name that it was something that had to do with our name. So my nickname or camp name was Merry Christmas.
Of course
Oh,
it is.
of course
So
it
you had to make a name
was.
like that. Everyone had that camp name. So I was Merry Christmas. So yeah.
Nice,
So I think I've heard
nice.
it all. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to make sure you were feeling good. You know what I mean? That you got it in there, right? Love having you on here, Mary. And look, we are live, so we love seeing that. We see folks are coming in to the chat. We love having you here, Lady Lakeisha. We see you, Christine. We see you.
What's up? I ain't seen Keisha in a minute. How y'all?
Yeah.
How you doing?
How you doing? Yeah.
How you doing?
Well, we're having a good time, and we'd love to, as we're having this. This is a conversation, a community conversation live with Mary, talking about how do we kind of maneuver through this justice work a little bit. How do we get through that idea of fatigue? And so, if you guys have questions, if you want to ask Dr. Glenn a question, or Mary a question, or you want to ask us a question, or put your own things, man, this is what we want to do here, right? So,
yeah, if jump in there in the comment section if you hear this, and I'm curious, what level of fatigue are you at with as it pertains to this conversation, these cultural conversations? Are you a level 10, meaning you are just worn completely out?
right.
You're almost to the point of checking out, like hopeless, or number one being like, I'm still ready to go, super revved. Let's go take over the world. Like, I'm curious to see, where are you guys in it? Because I feel like there's a lot of people that are around 7 or 8 these days.
Well, and that's a question I have for you, Mary, because like we said in the intro, right? Like you're, Fuller has this new degree plan, this Master's of Justice and Advocacy, which I'm so jealous of and wish I could get into. But in the midst of that, you're dealing with a lot of folks who have been in justice work, practitioners in it for a long time. Some of them, 30 plus years or such and such. So how are you? This is a new program, so you're getting a lot of new folks. What would you say the level of sort of fatigue and maybe tiredness is that you across the board by the students that you've worked with thus far in the program? What do you think?
Yeah, I would think it's pretty high right now because I think it's not just the climate that we're living in the United States and in the world, but I think you also add on to that COVID and the global pandemic and people feeling isolated. And I think one of the best things to combat fatigue and burnout and discouragement is community, whether we're with people or whether we just know that they're present for us. I think that's such an important part of our well-being. And so I think living through a pandemic has escalated and intensified the fatigue that we're feeling right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's what I hear all the time from people, whether in my capacity as a chaplain or as an educator. I'm just really tired and I don't have any reserve. I don't have any margin. It feels like that's kind of gone away in the last few years that we've been living in.
Yeah, and it feels like
it probably contributes to our inability to respond well to tough situations. And so people are a little more on edge, and the communication is more, has a tendency to be more toxic and therefore produce even more fatigue, right? Because now you're hearing people who have less grace in their responses and feel more on edge. And so that almost produces this sort of cycle of tiredness producing other tiredness.
Yeah.
I think even though it takes more work, I think we actually have to be more intentional with creating boundaries right now because our reserves are so low and our vulnerability is so high. I think we have to take that extra time and effort to create those boundaries that will keep us safe. Because I think we're just all very vulnerable right now, especially if you're in any kind of peace and justice, practitioner type work. I think there's a lot of vulnerability.
Do you want? I wonder too, like, because I do think people they always find a way to have community in some aspect. And so I think over the last, year and a half or so, the way people have been doing community has been a bit more homogenous,
Mhm.
right? Like they don't have the if I can say the word, like forced diversity of
Right.
community. In that, they go to a job and they're at
Right.
the work, or they're, on the streets, or they're wherever those places that they go. And it feels like we have created community, but we've created these communities that are echo chambers for
Right.
ourselves.
Right.
And so, is there any, and I don't know if you deal with this indirectly, but I'm just wondering, even in the moment right now, like having sort of a diverse engagements, does that in some ways actually bring more peace into your life, as opposed to just when you kind of surround yourself with people who just think like
Yeah.
you? You know what I mean? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Well, one of the things that I think about a lot is Noah's Ark. And you have, two of every kind.
Hmm.
And it was a place where God brought together the contraries,
Huh.
right? And yet
Yeah.
there was something about that was beautiful. It was messy and it was beautiful.
Hmm.
And I think the opposite of that, I think the Tower of Babel. Like
Right.
we thought, we were thinking like, oh, this is so great. Look at what we're doing. And we're all thinking in the same way. And yet I think it can be very damaging. So I think there's a way to do it that we're not exposing ourselves, especially in this hyper polarized
Yeah.
season that we're in. I think there's a way to do it that we don't create the echo chambers, but we also don't put ourselves in places where we can be even further,
Traumatized.
traumatized or damaged by the experience. And I think it takes a lot of intentionality. Maybe that would be a key word that we need to use right now, is really being intentional about who we're surrounding ourselves with, the voices that we're listening to. I think about one of the assignments I give students in vocation formation classes I teach is to interview someone who is of a different cultural context than them. Maybe someone that they wouldn't necessarily choose to interview, because when you listen to them and you listen to their life and the way that they practice wellness in God's shalom, there's something that you can learn from that. And so I think when we are just with people that think like us or see the world like us, we may not learn as much from each other in that process. So, and I think that's partly by God's design. I go back to Jeremiah 29, our peace is intertwined. And so there's something in the other person that we need for wellness to experience God's shalom. And even though that can be so hard to swallow most of the time, I just have to keep bringing myself to that our wellness, our peace is intertwined.
Yeah, and that goes back to a term that I think maybe the first time I heard it was in one of your classes, this Ubuntu. Really just, I need you ultimately to be me. Like that's this
And
aspect of humanity needing each other to actually even experience what true humanity is about.
I think that the way it goes is I need you to be fully me.
Yeah.
And you need me to be fully you.
Yeah.
Which kind of even brings it to another
Even more
level.
so, another level, a
Yeah.
deeper level, because again,
Yeah.
the fully peace, and that's again, it's the idea of none of us exists on an island and in isolation.
Mhm.
None of us does anything in some ways by ourselves. We don't even learn how to be human unless we have other humans in our lives. When you're born as a baby, you don't. You are human. I'm not saying that you're not a human being, but to learn how to
Right.
really exist and function as a human, you need your parents or other folks to come in contact with to help you kind of guide you in what it looks like. And then every aspect and every encounter you have along the way, in some ways affects you and affects how you will look at life differently. Every little encounter, right? There's no encounter that's lost. It starts to adjust how you see the world. And so, yeah. And I'm thinking though, go ahead, Antoine, and
I would say that concept runs so contrary to the American cultural idea of
individualism.
of
Right.
actualization. Yeah, the American dream wouldn't use term like actualization, but
Right.
the actualization of fulfillment and flourishing of our lives is so tied to our individual selves and the exceptional optimization of our individuality, and not in relationship to what I am to those around me and what those around me are to me. It doesn't fit neatly in the way the American culture, sort of presents itself.
And I think it leads us to destruction. This is kind of what we're doing. We're tearing each other apart through
Yeah.
this process. And it's not just that I need you, but you need me.
Mhm.
Like there's an accountability. There's something that's beautifully designed by God in our relationship, in our thriving, our flourishing. And I think especially in these days that we're living in, where there is so much trauma, there is so much injustice, navigating that, we cannot do that alone, but we have to fight the ideals that are so deeply instilled in us. And I
Yeah.
think this is one of the big conversations we're having right now, especially in the United States, but it's not just limited to us. There's other places in the world, but we kind of pride ourselves on our individualism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's becoming our weakness actually right now.
Mm.
So yeah.
Yeah, and the scriptures have so much to say about that. You go to 1 Corinthians 12, which is the easiest one to deal with that, where he says we're one, certainly for the believer, we're one body, and who is the eye to say to the hand, I have no need of thee? The reality is, to say it in an opposite way,
Yeah.
the eye should say to the hand, I have need of you. Like you are necessary for me, even if your function is completely different than mine. So
And authenticity and vulnerability are so important in our wellness. When we're feeling the trauma, we're feeling the weight of this work. Our vulnerability and our authenticity to be able to express, I need this from you, or I need you in order for me to continue on in this way. There's something obviously very difficult about that,
Yeah.
but that's what we need in order to thrive in the way that God has designed us to.
Yeah, this for the communal piece, and I was looking up some more stuff about Ubuntu, and I was looking at it. It's said another way as well, where it says, "I am because we are."
We are, yes.
Right. So that's, again, it's this almost this heightened understanding of the community, right? When we are doing the things that we need to do, that each person individually gets to fully be themselves. Again, going counter in some ways to, I think, sort of the way we think about things in America, where we would push against some of that stuff, right? We would think more individually. And yeah.
And I think God himself, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, there is collaboration, there is community, there is vulnerability, there's interdependence in the very identity of God. So why do we think that we would be any different? And we would somehow not need anyone? Like, we're not greater than God. And so I think, again, going back to that authenticity and vulnerability and just being real about who we are and what we need. And there's no way that we will navigate the roads ahead alone. It's just
Right.
not possible.
Yeah, and even in the Trinity, some may say it's sacrilegious, but there's a diversity there, right? Like that's part of the beautiful thing is each one of them, each person has different, responsibilities, gifts, forms, right? Like that make up the whole, which again is for us in the Christian standpoint, is the whole version of this communal expression, the image of God, imaging that is exactly coming through the Trinity. And I think because we're not engaging in some of that, we find ourselves much like, I'm looking on the chat here. I see Julie in there. Hey, what's up, Julie? And I see Akeisha, and they're saying, 7 and 8 is where they are. They feel, that they're getting on the heightened end of the spectrum. And I see you, Julie. You're saying you're not completely burned out, but I think that's where I think some of that comes is in this disengagement from each other, and disengagement from folks who may give us a different perspective on things. It becomes almost toxic, to me. Our own thoughts become just toxic because there's no place for them to be challenged, and no place for them to even be communicated with as a teaching method or a mind expansion method of somebody else. You know what I mean? Where you feel that, that rush you feel, Mary, you're a teacher. You see that the rush you feel when someone you show them something that and they learn something new. You're like, I'm valuable, right? Like I've opened the mind of someone else to a thought process, and they accepted it. So that's one thing, and accepted it. And there's something beautiful about that. And again, that takes two to tango in the midst of that. People have to be open to that. So that's a difficult thing.
In addition to having our community and being engaged with a diverse community, diverse in thought and experience and context from us, we also have to re-engage with ourselves and with God. I think that's really important. I think for me, one of the most important things I think about in the work that I've done as a chaplain, and just even doing community building work, that I have to have a sense of who I am not just in what I do. It has to be defined by the community, but most importantly by God, that I am God's beloved. That's really important that I stay rooted in that in order for me to do any of the work that God invites me to do, because otherwise it becomes my responsibility and everything that I have to shoulder rather than me working out of the place of who I am.
Yeah.
And, that is, I'm reflecting who God is. I am an image bearer. I am a partner in God's mission. And so I think remembering that belovedness keeps me grounded,
Yeah.
especially when things get hard.
Do you
Yeah.
think
I do some work on identity, teach some things on identity. And one of the key lessons is what you just articulated. So much about our current day is about worth and about how much worth I have. And in many ways, this conversation is fueled by that desire question to be answered is, what am I worth? What are those like me worth? But as you said, as believers, when we settle who we are in Christ and our worth comes from that, then the work God has for us can spring out of not only our worth, but the worth we see in other people. And we're no longer driven by the questions about worth, but we're driven by the expression of what it means to love people in their full expression of their worthiness.
Yeah.
And right now, the culture wars are about questioning who has the most worth. Who
Who's
matters?
got the best brand? Who's
Yeah,
got,
who matters the most? Yeah.
right.
And do I matter? And the Christian has to say, Christ has already settled that you mattered. He died for you. So your worth is settled. You no longer should be asking that question. Now it should be, how do you live into that worth, into that purpose, and become what God made you to be, and pursue that. And now that's a shift of motivation. And it should be the difference between a Christian pursuing social justice work or a social optimization or the kingdom of God, heaven on earth, versus someone who's looking to be validated by the society around them to say, I actually do matter and I need you to tell me that. There's a slight difference in that motivation that could be the source of peace or chaos or confusion, where if you're settled, you have the peace, but if you are not settled, then you have the tension, and you live in the tension, and your whole interchange is filled with that sense of tension.
I like to distinguish between faithfulness and success, because I think as we focus on being who God has made us to be and called us to be and formed us to be, that we're just faithful. We just kind of we're practicing being rather than being obsessed or focused with success. And I think sometimes in peace and justice work, because we are living in a world so filled with injustices, it can consume us. And it's never ending. On this side of heaven, it is never ending. And so success will always leave us empty. And I distinguish, we celebrate when there are major movements towards justice and peace. But defining the way the world does success, I think, will just keep us on that hamster wheel, and we can burn out really quickly. So I think for me, I lived on a vineyard, and kind of an unusual experience. And the vine, in order for a vine to thrive, it had to have good soil. So I think of like our community.
Yeah.
It had to have deep roots, so it was connected to God, and it knew what its job was. It knew what it was there to do. And I think we have to really keep ourselves rooted, remind ourselves of our belovedness, and keep focused, like what's before us, because the world is going to take us off course and exhaust us.
Right.
Yeah. And the absence, to your point, thinking and focusing on the faithfulness can give you something to celebrate even when the successes aren't coming.
Yeah.
I think so much of the time when we don't see the success, it creates even a frustration, and it turns us into if I can, very frankly, just mean people at times. You know what I mean? Like we're not able to celebrate the fact that things are happening at all. You know what I mean? And so we're like, it didn't get here, and so I can't celebrate because this is the termination. It's like, yes, but it's here, and it was down low. It was much lower, and so we're moving towards that. How do we celebrate that in the midst of it.
Yeah.
And I'm curious because, again, you're dealing with a lot of practitioners in the justice world who've been doing this for a long time. What kind of are some of the key concepts? Like when you get them in your class, like what are some of the key concepts you put before them to try to help them maneuver through the justice conversation? And those who are listening, I see the folks on the podcast, like I want you to hear these key concepts that she's going to give. And I'm curious which one of these you need the most help in, because that'll help us maybe even go in the conversation. So what are some of the key concepts you deal with? And then maybe we can talk about where we need to expand.
One of the most important things, I think, as we're even, talking about like knowing who we are, that's the primary, our belovedness. But I think also remembering, the practice of remembrance. So for me, I think about like the Ebenezer stone and that, remembering those places where God helped us. I think whether we have it physically in our home, like maybe some photos or some different, artifacts or objects that help us to remember God's faithfulness in our lives, I think that's really important, because I think especially if we are in justice and peace work our whole lives, it's a long journey. And I think we have to remember God's faithfulness, the places where God met us, the places where we saw justice move forward, the places where we saw community thrive. So I think having those Ebenezer places are really important in our lives. And I'm a big person. I'm really into liturgy and ritual. And I think, part of the gift of that is it always gives us space to look back. As much as we're always looking forward and being present, we also want to look back and remember. So for me, that's one of the important things.
Yeah, and if I can, because
Yeah.
I think, you can go back and change my.
I was to say, never mind. I won't say it.
I think it's the book Soul of the City. I think that's the right name. The author, I there was a part of me, because you do so much talking when you teach. You really give a lot of credence to the city and the value of the city, right? And so I know that there's been times I've gone to big cities and seen churches, big ornate churches that were completely empty, and I've been so frustrated. Why did these churches spend all this money on this church? Blah blah blah. But one of the things when I was reading through that book that was really fascinating to me, I think the author articulates like the presence of a church becomes a marker and a reminder for the city that God exists as they walk by it. Even if it's not full, it's just a reminder, it's a marker. And so I use that when I go to the cities now to give me joy in the midst of the things I'm seeing. I was like, oh, that's right. That this is a reminder that God is present. And so that's what I think about when you're talking about that remembrance, is like, are there these little sort of monuments, if you will, in your life or in your work or in your space that can remind you that God is present, or that God has been good in these spaces, right? So, and
I think when we see God present in our past, we can see more clearly God in our present, in our future. And so I think that's really helpful. That's one of the things, or one of the reasons why I love doing city walks, is because it brings history alive, because we're always part of history. I don't think necessarily of past, present, and future separately. I see it very intertwined.
Right.
And so I think, and especially, God is not bound by time. So kind of simultaneously happens, not for us. We're bound by time. So, I think remembrance is important. And I think it's not just for the places where God met us. It's the places where we experienced God's presence. It's the place where we had a loss, but we found hope in that place of pain. So I think that remembrance helps us in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
I think the other one is living in the tension of pain and lament and joy.
Okay.
And a lament is such an important practice. Of course, now people are talking about it much more these days, which I'm grateful for, but it's an ancient Christian practice. And I think
it didn't just come around now. It feels like it's only new. It's like
I think
we never heard of it until like the last
Psalms
year.
might tell us something different. So
they should.
There's a lamentations kind of.
You would think, but.
And it's interesting because reading Psalms today has a very different feel than when I was a teenager and a new person of faith reading the Psalms. I used to be frustrated, like, why are they complaining? Or they kind of sound like, crybabies. And now I'm like, I don't think that they're being forthright enough. They need to say more.
When you know the truth of what's really going on, you're like, this guy should be saying a lot more than this. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I think lament is really important because it acknowledges what is. And I think when we, sometimes I'm in circles and people just say, you just got to push through. You just got to, don't give space to that. Don't dwell in that. But actually, both God's example and the scriptures tell us that there is a place for lament. It's important to our well-being. And I say we are not a bottomless pit of emotions.
Yeah.
We don't get to stuff our whole lives. It eventually comes back up. And it's better to lament as pain comes into our lives. And pain is not, and I think we talked about this in the last call, pain is not chronological, it's seasonal and cyclical. And so it comes back in different ways we experience it. And so lament, I think, helps to remind us that God is with us and that we can give these things to God, that we don't have to carry and shoulder these things. And that it's okay to feel the pain and to be disappointed, to be sad about what has happened. So the practice of lament is really important, but that has to be sometimes simultaneously experienced with joy. Both are really important to our flourishing.
Yeah, and I want you to keep going on with joy in a second, but I think when you talk about some of the fatigue, at least for me, in the midst of the fatigue, I think part of where I get really fatigued is the lack of willingness to lament. You know what I mean? I think there's this push against it. And again, we can talk about a lot of this stuff in sort of the personality of our American society if we want to, in the American church. There seems to be this we kind of have
Right.
almost like this triumphal attitude, like we can't accept that anything wrong has ever happened, that anything's happened to us. We have to keep it moving, right? You'll hear, hey, don't dwell in the past, like keep it moving, right? But
Yeah.
we forget that so much of who we are in the present is affected by the things that we've gone through in the past.
Yeah.
And particularly and I think the practice of remembering those things, whether it's for, remember those things for things to inspire us, or just even remind us that we are mortal, right? And that we make mistakes and that we have pain. I think those,
And that those mistakes matter, that
Yeah.
that there's an effect
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
mistake that we make.
Rest and lament are the practices that remind us of our humanness, that we are human and God is God. And I think, and in a way, it doesn't just acknowledge it to ourselves, but it acknowledges it to God that, okay, we're not you. We're not God. We acknowledge that we're human and that we need you. There's something really powerful about the practices of rest and lament specifically that acknowledge our limitedness.
Our limitations.
Our limitations, yes.
Or we can make up words. That works too.
We do that. We make up words all the time.
Limitedness. Let's make that a word.
Let's say limitations.
Put it in the new lexicon. The color commentary lexicon. Limitedness.
That's it. This is what we do.
Yeah, and it's good. I mean, the lament, but I think the frustration is when you're trying to kind of bring the opportunity to, because what you're saying is lament is an opportunity to actually make God's name greater, right? Instead of ourselves. And so at least in the justice work and the work that I get into when I'm coming to churches and I'm saying, hey, we need to lament these ways in which we participated in some of the things historically, there's this pushback to, no, we don't have time for that. But the lament is,
or there's a weakness to acknowledging these emotional.
Right. Yeah.
There's a frailty there that I don't want to deal with. Yeah.
And again, that goes back to vulnerability and authenticity are part of our identity. It's part of our belovedness. That's part of, we acknowledge that's what it means to be human. And so my pushback when people will say to me, I don't have time to lament, or I don't want to give space to that, I ask them why. And I think we have to ask more questions to get to why people are resistant to a practice that has been part of the Christian tradition for, forever.
But has it? I mean,
not the American.
That's
Christian
what I'm saying. Like, yeah, or certain denominations
in America. Yeah.
Scripture. I'm talking about biblical examples.
I know you're right.
And the ancient church, right? I
mean, that should be. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that we have to address. I always say that culture can help us to grow in our spirituality, or it can be a hindrance and a block. And what we've identified, in our conversation thus far, individualism and this resistance to show weakness and vulnerability. those are ways that our American culture are keeping us from growing spiritually, or at least the kind of spirituality that we want to embody. Because there are
because
different
those are the
kinds
things
of
that,
theologies
sorry,
and spiritualities.
yeah, those are the things that are going to frustrate spiritual practices or Christian practices like confession and lamentation, because we're terrible at confession, and therefore terrible at lamentation, because
Go together.
we don't want to talk about what we've done wrong, and so therefore we really don't want to lament what we've done wrong either, because we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to bring it up. Whereas I think James 5 talks about confessing to each other, and that it brings healing, and I think that's part and parcel, like part of the rest, part of the rejuvenation of our souls is the acknowledgement of our failures, the confession of that failure, and the opportunity for forgiveness by our peers, in that failure, and the reconnection of that community we started out talking about, the life, if you will, the connectedness, as opposed to the separation that is death, that could bring, that reconciliatory action brings. Otherwise, to ignore those things is to further dig the ditch between us and other people,
right,
in the name of progress or in the name of moving forward. And in so doing, we suffer a kind of death and live in that kind of death.
But what you're saying about confession and lament connects us back to Ubuntu. Like, even in our lamentations and our lamenting, we are connected to each other, and we need each other in this process of confession and lamenting. I mean, again, it's the way that our lives are intertwined. We need each other.
Yes, absolutely. Now you mentioned, so I'm looking. I see Mary. I see you there. She said, "I'm tired. I'm very, very tired." There it is, right there.
Yeah.
And so you were talking a little bit about some of the ways in which, again, you got folks who've been doing justice ministry for decades, and you're going, okay, here's the way they're coming in. I'm sure they're saying the same thing. Like, I'm just tired, Mary. I'm just tired. And so the response in some ways is you're giving us some of these concepts. One is this belovedness, right? Being able to understand who we are in the midst of God and how He sees us. Remembrance, right, which is this opportunity to say, what has God done? What is God doing, right? What has God said He's going to do in aspects? And then you've talked a little bit about this living in the midst of the pain, like allowing that pain to kind of, maybe you didn't say this, but I kind of say, let the pain wash over you and experience the lament, because it reminds you of your limitation and your need for God, which is where you can always find
and
rest,
each other,
right? And each other. And then you were going to mention this idea of joy, right? So how does that kind of work in the midst of it? Maybe that'll be Mary, maybe that'll be helpful for you as we think through Mary Myers on our chat here. Maybe that'll be helpful for her.
So there's a great video. I can send you the link of Miroslav Volf and Willie Jennings having a conversation about joy and the work that's been done at Yale in regards to joy and suffering. And you think about throughout time, people groups who have suffered and the way that joy has sustained them. I think of joy not just as sustaining us through the places of pain and lament, but I think of joy as the ideal, the hope that God wants us to enter into in His presence. And that does not deny pain. It does not deny past. It does not deny suffering. But it helps us to live into the promises and the realities that God has created for us. So I really kind of lean into the teachings of Willie Jennings and Miroslav Volf in this, that it's oftentimes in the places of greatest suffering and lament and pain that we have the potential to experience the greatest joy of the Lord in that.
So what I'm hearing you, like what I just heard you say, there's two thoughts. So if I'm a person listening to this, I heard what could feel like abstract, contradictory concepts, because when I think about joy, I imagine a kid eating ice cream, or the joy found in a birthday party when everyone's having a great time, and there's no persecution in those pictures of what I understand joy to be. But then so I'd ask you to comment on the concreteness of that. And then the other thing that I heard, though, is a connection of joy to hope, which which it sounded to me like what you were saying, is that hope has such an anchor to what it is, to our joy, that even in the midst of crazy things, it is this expectant hope that God is good, that things are, there's something expectant in our hope
Yeah.
that drives our joy in the face of our current difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
And I wondered if I was hearing that correctly.
Yeah.
So the first one is the abstract notion of the two contradictory ideas, because I think a lot of people, including myself, sometimes have a hard time wrestling with what does it look like to have joy and pain.
So I'll address that one first. So I'll give an example, because when I think about this tension of pain and suffering and joy, I think this is part of the mystery of God that we lean into, and it's part of the messiness, the complexity, and the beauty that we experience simultaneously. And I think as humans, our desire, I think that's why we prefer very concrete. This is this, this is that. We don't like those complexities because it gives us a feeling that we're not in control. The reality is none of us are in control. We have control over our choices, but we think we're more important than we really are in controlling the world. And I think part of leaning into this tension, again, is an acknowledgement of our humanness. But I want to give you a concrete example. So in Skid Row, we have countless numbers of kids, babies, infants, young children that live on Skid Row. And a good friend of mine, Sister Mary, check her website out, Worthy of Love. It started because her and her husband weren't able at the time to have children, or they had lost a baby, and they wanted to be able to throw birthday parties. And so they, I think, met each other on Skid Row. You can go to their website and find out their story. But what they do is they throw monthly birthday parties in Skid Row. They are these amazing experiences. In fact, last night was their monthly birthday party. And so they have a theme each month, and they have all kinds of people that come out and help. They have a dance crew, they have music, they have a mascot, and it is incredible joy. And yet these kids are living on Skid Row. Doesn't change their reality. So that is, for me, the example. There is suffering, and yet there are these moments of joy that are shared. And so I think for me, that's kind of how we experience in our life, that the pain, our joy does not make the pain disappear, but the joy carries us through the pain. And we live into it, trusting God to take us through it. But our pain, we can't erase it no matter what we do.
Right.
We carry pain with us. Like when I walk with people who are grieving some kind of loss, you're never going to get over that loss. You just learn how to carry it in different ways and learn how to acknowledge God carrying you and that loss throughout your life. But the joy helps us on the journey, keep our eyes up, rather than just what we have lost and what we've carried.
Is that like, when I think about that, I think, is that the true sort of definition of, or expression of, shalom? Like, there is a sense of, there's a peace, but the peace is not a false peace that everything in the world is right, that everything has been right, but the peace of being able to understand that, if I could say it in our terms, that God is in control nonetheless, and so there's a joy that comes. Is that sort of how that works? I mean, I probably brought in shalom in the wrong way, but that's kind of what I think about.
And I think we're kind of doing two things. We're kind of being faithful to the work before us, the justice work. We want to see change. We want to see hope. But I think we're also acknowledging that we can't control everything, that we can't control all that happens. You think about all those amazing, inspiring justice and peace practitioners and activists and advocates who went before us.
Yeah.
They left this earth with their work in many ways incomplete, but now it's on our shoulders. And we will do our part until we go, and then the generation behind us will pick up and shoulder that work. And so I think part of living in this tension is the acknowledgement we don't do it all. We are faithful to our part, whatever that is. And going back to what Anton was saying about hope, all of these things, joy, lament, hope, we practice these things and we experience them. So there's things that we can do. For instance, even thinking about what are some of those things that bring you joy, and how are you making space in your life so that you can practice joy and experience joy. So maybe it's you want to be on a spiritual retreat. Maybe it's helping out, volunteering with kids. So figuring out those ways that we can practice joy is one way that we can, I think, grow that in our life. One way that we can participate in it. The other thing I think that's really important to acknowledge is, like, for instance, hope. I always say this in my chaplain work. Whether we believe in hope or not, whether we can see hope, hope is there.
Yeah.
Hope and joy exist, whether or not we feel like it's attainable. And sometimes that helps me when I'm in such a place of discouragement and disappointment, to remind myself, or to have others remind me, hope is still there. It's always been there. It's just that our perception of hope has been diminished.
Yeah.
Do you think?
But
Do you think
hope
that?
is never diminished.
But do you
Indeed.
think, in the midst of that, like, and again, as you talk to folks, do people struggle when they're in the justice work, allowing themselves to feel joy and hope? You know what I mean? Is there? I think when I've talked about joy and hope in the midst of this, other folks and other practitioners almost see it as a cop out. It's like you're not allowing the weight of what's really going on to sit there. You know what I mean? Like it.
Yeah.
Again, it could be both and, but
Yeah.
but I feel like sometimes, like, we don't allow ourselves to have the joy because it almost seems like it's not giving the work full attention, or
Yeah.
credibility.
I think
And I
that
think,
goes back to our binary tendencies,
Okay.
yeah,
either or. I
yeah,
think we have to live into a both and. We can live in the lament and the joy and honor both of those realities. Jesus did it. That's the example that Jesus, as his suffering on the cross is unimaginable. And yet we also have images of him playing with children. If we only saw his suffering, right, we would be so limited in what, but he came to give us life and give it abundantly. And so I think that we can't use one to excuse the other, but we have to make space for both. And I think we have to resist the either or tendency that we live in.
I think in addition to that, I think there's just I think there's just a whatever the opposite of broad is. There's
Narrow?
a narrow, yeah, thank you. There's a narrow definition of what joy is that
Yes.
I think we need to allow it to breathe in a much more comprehensive way. I think we to Marcus's point, someone who would be saying that is imagining the pictures that I just talked about, this narrow version of momentary ecstatic happiness, as opposed to this living into an ethos, if you will, if I could say it that way, of joy, right?
Yes.
Where I've said it before, like joy is more like the sunshine that a bunch of stuff happens underneath, as opposed to the bad thing that happened. And so you can have sunshine. It could be a sunny day, and bad things can still happen, and yet it's still a sunny day.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to the way depression is often depicted as it being a rainy day, and really good things could be happening, and yet you still feel sad in the midst of that rainy. So we've gotten to where we really begin to understand depressive thoughts, which would be the opposite of joy. Depressive thoughts and the broad, comprehensive ways people live into depression despite outside of what their actually life situation is.
Right.
And there's a counter to that, where joy has a much broader power over how we live, that can do the same thing. And I just don't think that we've been taught to think about joy in so broad a way. I think we've narrowed joy down to a momentary feeling.
Well, we think of joy as an emotion like happiness, and
Yeah.
joy and happiness are not the same. I think of joy much more of a reality, of a practice, of something that we lean into, like we do gratitude or lament or our rootedness. I think emotions are very different. Like we can be joyful, but I
Yeah.
think joy is a very different concept.
Yeah.
And I think because we live in such a instant gratification, individualistic kind of world, I think we don't make the space to be reflective in this way and think
Yeah.
about concepts and realities as opposed to emotions, because emotions are the surface.
Yeah.
But what's below that?
Kind of the effect more than the cause. And then I'm also, someone brought up James 1, which was great. I think that was Mary.
Mm,
Brought up, count it all joy when you face these trials, and we see the contradiction in scripture instructing us on that.
yeah.
But I also I think a lot about faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love, but
Mhm.
even beyond the greatest of these is love is faith, hope, and love. The three things that are sitting
Together.
there, and really faith and hope are the two things, if you will, in my head, that fuel this joy, this trust that God is good, this hope that he is going to make all things work together for good, and that I'm going to be loving in the midst of it, is what can propel us out of our momentary situations into this space of joy wherever we are, where Paul can write, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice, to a persecuted church who's like, why are you telling me to be happy about the
Right.
persecution that
Which
I'm experiencing?
we have to be so careful about that, because that's so weaponized right now. Like
Yeah.
you need to suffer. Like this is part of God's
Yeah.
plan. And it's like,
Sure.
no, that's part of the brokenness of what we live
Of
in.
what we live in. Yeah.
But and God has redeemed us and it. But I think we have to be really careful the way things like suffering have been used in theology and spirituality to
Mm,
further the pain and the suffering.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to do in the church, but that'd be one
Yeah.
area I would suggest.
Fun stuff.
yeah. So I'm looking at, one of the things got thrown up in the chat is, putting these things together, the belovedness, remembrance, lament, joy, and probably hope is in the midst of that as well. And kind of the question to the listeners and the watchers, which one of these, practices is most difficult for you? Because I imagine, as you hear them, there's probably those things that are like, when somebody heard about like lament or joy or remembrance, it's like, oh man, I just don't do that very well. So I'm
Mhm.
curious, those watching, which one of these do you struggle with the most or most difficult for you? And then also just as a practitioner standpoint for you, Mary, when you're having these conversations and you're watching, and I know that it's in some ways the program is new, but in many ways you're dealing with this a lot of times in people's vocational formation anyway.
Mhm.
Uh, is there one of these that those who are in the justice conversation tend to, or you've seen generally struggle with the most, or do the least, practice the least, um, in your experience?
I think rest is probably the one that's really hard. I think what I find with practitioners is either they do lament really well or they avoid it. And
Okay.
the same thing with joy. But I find rest to be, because I think, and again, I always want to circle back to our belovedness. If we remind each other of our belovedness, which is not just that we're made in the image of God and the beauty of God that we carry, that we're uniquely made, but that we also have limits, our limitations, that we acknowledge those. And I think that's why rest is so important, because rest, I think, is one of the most important acts of worship. And, it's been written too about how rest is resistance. Rest can be part of the resistance, but more importantly, rest is what is good for our souls and our spirits, because it's the model that God gave us. God created and then rested. He didn't need to rest, but he was creating a rhythm for us to be part of with us.
Right.
And I think rest is the one that, when we feel like it's our responsibility and we shoulder it, it's like we just keep pushing ourselves and pushing ourselves. And then we eliminate the margin in our life. And without margin, without rest, we're acting on fumes out of, rather than abundance. And I always say that God is not a God of scarcity, he's a God of abundance. And we want to be able to flow from that abundance.
And
Mm.
and when you're talking about that, I see on some of the other folks, remembrance, lament, hope is a struggle. And I think that concept of rest is huge. And we've talked about in some of these characteristics or some of these concepts, of engaging this justice work, is that, again, there's a cultural obstacle that we have to get over to do it. And rest is a huge thing that we don't practice as a country. We're not even encouraged to do it. We're encouraged, like we lift up the people
Rewarded
who are
for the opposite.
rewarded
Yeah.
for the complete
Work
opposite.
harder.
That's
And
right.
And the most common response to how are you doing? I'm busy. I mean, I even acknowledged this morning when I greeted you, I was like kind of going through like how busy I was. And there is something about our shared practice of,
Yeah.
carrying it all and having a full life. And there's other countries in the world where it's typical for people to have 7 to 8 weeks of vacation.
Yeah.
And that is how they thrive. That's how they have a good sense of balance in who they are. I always say we're human beings, not human doings.
Yeah.
But we kind of live like that.
We do. And I think, what you said is, I think many people would probably, this piece would disagree, is that you're going, hey, other countries do this and they thrive. And people in America go, what other countries thrive like we thrive?
Yeah.
Right. Like, I think there's a sense that there's no other country as awesome as we are. And I'm not saying that we're not awesome, but whatever the other countries are doing, they're not us, and they're not producing what we're producing. They're not becoming what we're becoming, and what we have produced and what we have become is the top.
But that goes back to Ubuntu. If I need you to be fully me, then I have to acknowledge that I'm not the be all end all, and I've got it all figured out, either personally or collectively.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge barrier. Like I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as justice and peace practitioners in the US is our culture. I think it is doing us a huge disservice, and I think it's making us exhausted. And burnout.
When you say it's making the practitioners exhausted, or the people, period, or you could probably say both.
The people, but I think especially practitioners, because you're having to work against all of these cultural values. And I feel like there's a greater sense of urgency right now. And I'm not saying that we're not living in a really critical time. I believe we're living in one of the most critical times in human history.
Agreed.
But we are humans, and we cannot do the impossible, but God can. And so I think we have to manage, again, faithfulness rather than success, because it's like we have this checklist. I've got to do this and this and this. And I think about, people that are my heroes. Like I think about Biddy Mason, who is probably the most important Angelino. She was given as a wedding present, and was able to win her freedom in court in California, and did these amazing things in Los Angeles. I mean, she was able to care for those in need. She was able to win freedom for other people who were enslaved. She was one of the co-founders of the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. She was a waymaker in Los Angeles. I can almost bet money that she died not fulfilling all the things that she hoped to do. And the thing is, that legacy is now on us. And so I look at these amazing justice and peace practitioners, and it's not that their work was incomplete, but it was always shared. All of our work is always shared. It's never just on us to complete it. We do the part that's been entrusted to us. But when I think about Biddy Mason, I think about some of the things I do today. I am picking up where she left off. That's part of our call. And so I think if we look at it that way, rather than this is the one thing that I have to do, I think it frees us from the lie that we have to work ourselves to death, which in some ways is, I think, what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I think because things are so urgent, because things are as bad as they are right now, I think we're putting a ridiculous amount of stress on ourselves and on each other, and we're human.
Right.
We have to rest. We have to rest. Sustainability is so important. If we want to live as many years as we want to live and be involved in this work, we have to find ways that are sustainable for us.
It's so good. I mean, it's so much, man. I know we got to wrap up probably here in a minute, but so
Our time
much
is up already.
I know there's so much of what you just went into. I like 3 things. I'm like, man, I want to get into those. But man, this whole concept of, Marcus, you talked about, well, they're not those countries aren't as great as we are. And all that comes down to defining what great is. And what do you mean by great? If you mean
Sure.
by great, there were some sort of, we've got the most things and we seem to be the most powerful, have the most strength or whatever, maybe. Or is greatness, but our people are suffering, our people are tired, our people are mentally stretched, would it be better to be not as strong but healthy? Like it determines on what it is you determine success to be is the one thing, and then the other thing, which Mary, you ended up getting into it, is it all comes back to this general idea of success over faithfulness. I usually say back in my day, obedience, but maybe faithfulness is a better word. But I would say success is obedience to my team a lot. Like, it's not about the outcome. It's about your answer. Do you say yes to what God is doing and asking you to do? And that's all you concern yourself with. There's plenty of people in the scriptures who we would call unsuccessful by some metric of effectiveness. But if we define success by obedience and faithfulness, we would say they were successful, i.e. almost all the minor prophets, right? They hardly
Or
any of those
Hebrews.
message was received and you would say was very quote unquote effective. And
Right.
yet they're seen as being successful and,
Right.
and models that we should follow, not because they made the effect that they were intended to make as far as their audience is concerned, but because they were obedient to what God had told them to do. And in some cases, God told them, listen, they're not going to hear you. He tell them ahead of time, they're not going to hear you, but go and tell them anyway, do your part here. And that's going to be the success. And I think there is a lot of hope and rest that can be had in knowing that you're doing what God asked you to do.
Well,
Regardless
in
of the result.
Hebrews 12, the Hall of Fame, those people were faithful to the end, but they didn't see the fullness. A lot of them died without seeing the fullness.
Yeah.
And just as a closing thought, I think about if rest was important enough for Jesus to do in the midst of the crowds, he could have healed them all. He could have gone nonstop, but he modeled rest. There's something about the rhythms. We are human beings, our creation, we're part of creation, and creation itself are made with a rhythm. The sun rises, the sun sets. Like, we need those rhythms. We need to sleep. And I think what it acknowledges is God, the way that God designed us and the way that we have limitations. And God designed it that way so that we could live more sustainable and joy-filled lives in the midst of it. But if it's good enough for Jesus, it should be good enough for us.
Hey, that's the move right there.
It is a good move, and I'm thinking just from those who are in the work, at the point that I walk away with that I think you were talking about earlier is the culture we live in really fights against us in this work in the midst of it. One is, you're talking about, again, as we've been talking about, this sense of busyness, but even beyond the business, like the intensity at which we go after busyness. Those who follow me know I do CrossFit, right? And one of the things I learned very early on in CrossFit is, when you first get started with CrossFit, you look at the workout and it actually doesn't look that bad. It's real small numbers, whatever. And so what people will do is they'll just get out the gate, go full out, and I've been in it long enough now that I know those cats, and they get out ahead really far as far as sometimes you're competing and they get out ahead, but you're just like, you know what, that dude's going to just drop out here in just a little bit. We got 8 rounds and this is round 1 and they are cooking. And so it's the keys who make it all the way through, find a pace and they run at that pace. And I'll find it around round 5, that cat I'm just passing this dude and destroying it lately, right? Or the vice versa. Somebody's doing it to me because I'm coming out the gate too fast, And so this recognition that we're on a journey that has a pace, and there's things that are going to be left for others. We don't have to take care of it all. And so that's counter, I think, even to this American society that just is like, no, you got to get it all now. It's in today. Everything's got to happen right now. Yeah. So you got to push against that. And I think this idea of, we talked really big around individualism versus a collectivism thought process. You said something really, profound, I think, in how we've been taught even to think about the justice, the key figures in the justice work. We tend to only focus on key figures, but we don't recognize all the other folks who were around them. right? Like we can talk about the Montgomery bus boycott with Dr. Martin
Right.
Luther King, but if you read the book, like he is one of a ton of people that's making that happen. In fact, he's really just doing the speaking, right? Like there's other people women who've been working on it for years before he even showed up, right?
Or taking a step behind him, and Howard Thurman,
Oh yeah,
who shaped his spirituality.
absolutely.
We all play a part in activities. We all play a part in the justice work.
Yeah, but I think even in this collaboration aspect, right,
Mhm.
recognizing that again, I'll use Dr. King, like he wasn't doing this by himself. There was a collaboration of lots of different entities that were making this happen. That's the only way they survived.
Yeah.
But again, the way we're taught almost historically about those movements is by just key figures.
Yeah.
And this is why, I think there's this move to expand the conversation around history, particularly in the areas of Black history and in those areas, to see more figures and more people who were a part of it, and even look at I'll say it, in the Black community as a whole and how they sacrificed and suffered along to help Dr. King be able to do the things he was supposed to be able to do. And you can look at anybody. You can look at Ella Baker. You can look at Rosa Parks. You can look at any of those guys. You see, they always had these other folks that were there in a community that supported them. So as as people in the justice work, as people who are doing this, to try to do this by yourself is exhausting. And we're really big on collaboration, finding collaborations that go together. Those of you who are engaging with Threaded now, you'll see we're going to be, as we get into January, we're going to be doing some collaborations with some local other justice folks together, because we know that there's only so much that we as an organization can do, and really probably should do. It's going to be done better when we start putting other gifts in place. And so I love that. I think those are two big things, but they are fighting against the countercultural aspect that we have. But
can I share my favorite proverb with you all?
Please.
It's probably one you're already familiar with, maybe. It's an African proverb, and it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together.
Yes.
And I think we're part of the marathon, not the sprint.
Right.
And
right.
It's a long journey, and we don't do it alone. You think about all the people that have done any of the great kind of pilgrimages. These aren't like short little stints.
Right.
You got to do it in community to survive.
Yeah. We do a small group that we do through Threaded, and the getting to week 9 is called Arrivals. But what we talk about is this idea that you're not actually arriving at the end, but it's a series of arrivals, right? So you've got more things along the journey. And as you go along, you'll just keep hitting these new spots. It's just like life. It's just like your way you do life, the way you do Christianity, the way, like everything else, you understand this. And so it's the same in the justice work, that we are constantly in a series of arrivals. And so wherever you are in the midst of your journey, it is going to be a long haul. It is going to be work that's probably going to outlive you. You're going to keep getting better and going down the road. And as you do so, you want to find ways to remember your belovedness, how God sees you. You want to take those moments of remembrance. You want to take those moments to lament the things that have happened, to experience and to live into the places that you can find joy. And with that, hopefully you can see the hope that's coming. Antoine, you got anything? We're going to close out. So
it's closing stuff, which is, we talked a lot about community and needing to walk together and not doing it alone. And obviously there's a lot of people who are feeling kind of nomadic right now. They've left their churches, or they're in between churches. They're not quite sure where their community is going to be. Some of it as a result of how their church may have dealt with issues around justice and social issues. And so one of the ways that we at Threaded want to try to come alongside you in the middle of all of that is we do have something called the Threaded Community, which is kind of a Facebook-like community where you can come and discuss and talk and be around other people who are working and striving through this kind of space. And so we just, as a practical next step for some of you who may not be in that community yet, or you may have access, you just have never gone into it. I want to invite you just to be a part of that community and let one come and be a part of someone else's journey, and allow others to be a part of your journey, and where there's mutual encouragement that can happen. You can find out about that community on wearethreaded.org. And if you've interfaced with us in any sort of way, you should have access to the community. If you haven't, then just go down to the bottom of the screen and log in and say you want to get some communication from us, and you'll get access to the community in a series of emails. And if there's problems, you let us know. We'll figure that out. But it's one of the more practical. One of the reasons everything that we do at Threaded is designed to try to help deal with the problem of running alone and the problem of running unprepared. And so we're trying to provide resources for you to take the journey that you're on and move forward in your next step in that way. And we're trying to provide a community where you don't feel like you have to go alone. That's why we're doing this live. That's why we're doing this. We want to have interaction with you because we don't want you to feel like you're by yourself in the journey. It's not to blow up Threaded. It's to meet these needs that we think are important to meet. And so this is where the rubber grips the road for us. So if that's something that we can help you with, allow us to do that. It'd be our great pleasure to provide resources and to provide a community where you can move forward well.
Yeah. And I think part of providing resources is bringing on amazing guests like Mary. And she's getting strong arm from me to produce some short webinars for our Threaded Collective as well. The Threaded Collective is kind of our education space for folks where you can get in for $10 a month or $100 for the year and just get access to practitioners, professors, faculty, ultimately of Threaded that come in and help put some things in there to help educate you and to move you along the journey in some of the places that you may not know about. And so Mary is going to do that for us as well. And so I'm making her commit with a head nod right here on we've been talking about it. So it's exciting. So hopefully, man, it's Mary. So glad to have you here as always.
Always a pleasure.
Have you back on the show, a veteran, the faculty here.
Love being with you all. And if I could just say, in case you haven't heard it today, you are God's beloved.
Amen.
Yeah. Amen. We need to hear it. So hopefully you heard that. And hopefully you were challenged a little bit in here today. That's what we do. Hopefully you were able to see things through a different lens. Because, as we come into this space, we want to bring you different lenses, different colorful lenses, so that you can go out into the world and see all the different ways God created this world. And that's why when we get finished here, we always invite you to stay colored.